Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 6 cheat sheet, and this video has been recorded after the Champions League games were finished, but before the Europa games have been played. So, of course, there could be some injuries there. Do keep that in mind, and of course, press conferences are still to go. But this is really the updated cheat sheet based on my sort of view of things for the next 3 to 8 game weeks. Of course, this is a point where a lot of people might still be considering the wild card. If you're on the wild card, do check out the wild card video. Otherwise, let's crack on with the cheat sheet. As far as the budget mids, what I've done is actually taken out the 4.5 price bracket. I think the reality is now that Nakamba's so close to a double game week fixture, if you really want to create some sort of 3-4-3 team, then just go with Nakamba. At 5.0 to 5.9, Danjuma rises towards the top just because you're so close now to fantastic fixtures in game week 7 and 8. And he, of course, is one of the few players here with really, really good attacking pedigree, particularly in open play, even going back to multiple years now with Villarreal. And so Danjuma is an interesting player. I do like Gordon, but the concern, of course, is minutes. And for example, with someone like Danjuma, I'm expecting consistent starts from him from this point out. Whereas with Gordon, even though he's actually started a lot of games, you know that there could be chances where he gets subbed off at 55 minutes, 60 minutes, or he can even full on play the 90 minutes. But the concern, of course, with Newcastle having a lot of fixtures over this run is that because they have added depth in the team right now, even though Gordon can both play left wing and right wing, the wing that he actually got the penalty in, that's the concern overall with his minutes. However, he's a very good pick, and I do think if you're, let's say, looking at a little bit of rotation, maybe Gordon can be great. As far as Andreas, Enzo, Gibbs White, I do think Enzo is quite positionally dependent because right now he's playing quite advanced due to injuries, but those injuries are still at place in Chelsea, and so maybe his positioning will remain very, very good. And of course, the thing about Chelsea, though, is that their attacking fixtures are still good for the next 2 or 3 games, but it does taper off. So if you're looking at someone like Enzo, he's not going to be someone that you can actually play in your team consistently. And this really goes with anyone in this price bracket. I would say Neto is the one who, as we've been saying so far, is continuing to actually look like a better and better pick. We actually gave him, an introduction to the cheat sheet last week, and he did incredibly well, even in a tough fixture. So you're seeing that this Wolves team, as we were saying, can be upgraded from an attacking point of view due to what Gary O'Neill has been able to do over the last 2 seasons with both Bournemouth and so far, with a small sample size with Wolves. And so Neto being a 90-minute player is very, very interesting. I think he does deserve a rise. As far as Andreas, he actually gets the opposite, right? He gets a fall because the Luton Town fixture is gone. His underlying stats have dropped off a cliff from last season. So he's one of the few players where I think he will continuously drop if we see no sort of improvements from him so far. We did actually expect him to be the talisman of the team. But of course, this Fulham team have really struggled to create a serious offense at this point in time. So actually, when you're, let's say, looking at these Chelsea fixtures, maybe you can even argue, let's say, a Fulham fixture is really good on paper because Fulham are really struggling to create serious attacking opportunities. With Gibbs White, it's an odd situation once again, where of course you've got Man City next and then decent fixtures after that. And because he is arguably a talisman as well, unfortunately, he's not really shown too much in terms of points. His underlying stats have actually remained relatively consistent from last season, so that makes him still a healthy pick. Not someone as concerning as Andreas, but I do think he could also drop in the time being. Someone like Awani, of course, is already starting to surpass, let's say, Gibbs White quite a fair bit in terms of underlying stats. The difference, of course, is we still have a weightage, for example, in our head with Gibbs White being the penalty taker for this Nottingham Forest team, which obviously adds to his value. But if we're starting to see, let's say, a continuous drop down in his underlying stats, then of course Gibbs White will sort of drop as well alongside Andreas. As far as Douglas Luiz, he gets a rise. The simple reality is Douglas Luiz is going to be one of those picks where you're going for him in a 3-4-3 structure, or you're going for him in a Salah structure and you're finding some sort of rotation with Aston Villa. Yes, of course, you can actually go with Douglas Luiz in your team, but it's not the best pick. He's just a differential. He is the penalty taker for this team. And of course, he's on a multitude of different set pieces too. But the value, as I say, with some of these players is very, very strange to sort of guess, because you're getting them not necessarily from easy fixtures where, let's say, if you're a player who is very good in open play, usually what happens is that your best opportunities to score and to haul are actually in some of the easier fixtures. Whereas with players who are on set pieces, like a James Ward-Prowse, like a Douglas Luiz, it's a little bit harder actually to guess when the points will come. Now, of course, James Ward-Prowse has actually done incredibly well in some tough fixtures, scoring versus City as a good example of that too. But it's still very hard to sort of justify going to these picks at times because the underlying stats still pale a little bit in comparison. For example, if you looked at non-penalty stats, Douglas Luiz would really pale in comparison. As far as the 6.0 to 6.9 players, no changes really, other than the fact that we have 2 differentials now in terms of Doku and Trossard. Differentials in terms of percentage owned. I actually think they're very, very good picks and better than, for example, the differential tier of assets. And that's why, because of the Bernardo injury, because of, let's say, Grealish, you could argue that Doku actually deserves an entry towards the cheat sheet. And the same thing with Trossard due to the Martinelli injury. Now, Grealish is actually in training again, so maybe you could argue that Doku doesn't really belong here. However, I do think that you have maybe 2 fixtures where Doku can actually be a very good pick. And even at this sort of price point, that's sort of what you need, right? You're looking at these Man City picks as a differential for 2 weeks, and then actually you're moving away from these Man City players into, let's say, someone from a Diaby towards a even Madison, or let's say Son, if you can actually upgrade by then. So it isn't a unique position. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but Doku is quite interesting. Same with Trossard. These are high upside picks that actually now, fortunately, due to some injuries in their team, can actually get really, really good minutes. With Mitoma, unfortunately, even though he has a perfect fixture versus Bournemouth, my concern still is a lot of fixture rotation, which doesn't really affect him too much because I think he's the most nailed player on the team. However, the issue is still that Brighton's games overall are very, very poor, even from an attacking point of view. Now, of course, they did great versus Man United, and ultimately, we should probably say that Man United's defense isn't particularly good, but we know that this Brighton team really are a top 3, top 4 attack in the league, and so there's nothing really to scoff at when Man United actually conceded as much as they did versus Brighton, because that's really what Brighton do to teams. As far as Almiron, he gets a drop because of, unfortunately, the benching the previous week, and also, with Gordon actually existing at a much cheaper price, I do think Gordon appeals a little bit more. As I've been saying, though, still, I wouldn't tap into the Newcastle midfielders so soon. I still think that even, for example, the attackers, you're starting to see a lot of pain. For example, Isaac getting multiple starts in a row, and then suddenly Wilson gets consistent starts, and Wilson might once again get another start in the Premier League this weekend. So it's very hard to actually justify going for some of these Newcastle picks. You could be actually picking the right pick. And for example, you could even pick someone who actually comes off from the bench, and someone like Barnes, like in game week 1, can get, a double-digit score. It's very tough, and I think you don't want to put yourself in a position where you're actually constantly picking very low X-Mins players. And that's why I don't really like Almiron. With Gross, I've actually added him towards the cheat sheet just because he actually appeals as a differential. If you're actually looking at someone who plays for this Brighton team, has done quite well so far, I do think Gross is interesting. His underlying stats are very constant from last season. He's not on penalties, but actually when you look at the underlying stats, the fact that he's actually very close to the expected goal involvement of Mitoma is super interesting to me, because I would actually argue he's even more nailed than Mitoma, but we don't really treat him as an attacker. So that's why I make that distinction. As far as the 7.0 to 7.9 players, no changes here. And the same thing with the 8.0 to the 8.5 players up until Son as well. So the reason why I wanted to actually defend all of the sort of ratings of these players is because even when you're looking at a player like Madison, he's a very easy hold in your team unless, you're wildcarding, and then have the opportunity to move back into Madison game week 8. If you're not wildcarding, all of these players should really still be holds in your teams. With Sterling, for example, I think he still looked much more brilliant than Jackson in the previous game. And it's easier to, for example, keep Sterling in your team because he's cheaper compared to what Jackson can be replaced with in the forward position. So that's one thing I would say for now. So Sterling is quite nice in that the next 2 to 3 fixtures are actually quite good. So I would still keep Sterling for now. And the same logic holds with Foden too, where particularly even if I was wildcarding, you can see in the wildcard video, I've actually suggested to go with Foden because you can actually go with Foden for a 2-week punt. As far as, let's say, the Manchester United midfielders, I know that's going to cause a lot of controversy, but you can already see it in the Bayern Munich game. They are capable of scoring. And yes, of course, Rashford and Fernandes only got assists. Casemiro got a brace. It shows the quality that this United team can have, even versus a top team like Bayern. And the fixture run is undeniably good for Man United. So even though, yes, of course, someone like Salah just can't stop scoring and can't stop hauling, I don't think it's fair to completely brush away the Man United players. I do think actually when you look at, let's say, fixtures, United have really good fixtures until game week 12. It's a little bit different to compare, let's say, the Chelsea attackers, where I think they have a much smaller and shorter sort of lifespan in your teams because the punt for the fixtures is actually about to end. With United, in fact, now that you've actually come across the Arsenal game, come across the Brighton game, the 2 tougher fixtures that they've had in this sort of calendar run, you're now looking at a sea of green fixtures where this is where you're finally expecting good hauls from this United team. So I would not be so concerned about United. And actually, I would hold these picks unless you have really the luxury position of 2 free transfers to move into Salah. So that's my position, and that's why Salah, of course, gets a rise. He gets a home game here. This is a good opportunity if you got 2 free transfers to move into Salah. If you're wildcarding, I'd probably also move into Salah. However, I'd also just keep an eye open towards actually keeping some United picks because the fixture run is still good. However, we also do have some other appealing options like in the forward position and also like in the defender position too. So moving towards the forward position now, I think the only change that I've done is I've taken Adebayo out. I just think that he's too much of a risk in terms of his minutes. Now, Amdouni's going to get a lot of expected minutes because of the Foster red card. Foster has been suspended for 3 games as a result of that, which means Amdouni's minutes should be very, very safe. The issue, of course, is when you're looking at the double game week fixture, the reason why I don't like Amdouni is because one of the fixtures is Newcastle. And as I was saying, I don't like the chance, or rather the lack of opportunity for you to actually get 2 rolls of the dice. So for that reason, I don't really like Amdouni too much as a pick compared to Morris. But I think because his minutes are very safe and because this Burnley team have actually shown that they're actually still quite a competent attack, he could be a little bit of a differential for you. Now, João Pedro is an interesting one because I've been actually telling people to hold on to João Pedro unless they had the chance to move into Alvarez in Game Week 4. Now that you're actually looking at João Pedro's best fixture in a while, I do think obviously this is a very easy week to hold into him. I would not transfer into João Pedro, but actually, if you, let's say, for example, see that he's rotated in the Europa League, that's a good opportunity to, let's say, be very confident in João Pedro, right? A game like Bournemouth at home is just fantastic. Later on in the season, when we maybe see a little bit more injuries or maybe less rotation possibilities, then João Pedro could be a better pick. I think it's very hard to sort of move him truly into sort of a green asset price tier just because the minutes are so uncertain for me. And even though the penalties are there, it's not enough to sort of sway me either way. As far as Edouard and Nketiah, Edouard gets a rise and Nketiah is still differential. We saw Jesus start in the Champions League. I think we can still see Jesus start some games, and that's sort of what's making both Jesus and Nketiah not so particularly good picks, because right now you're concerned that Nketiah can still take a lot of minutes away from Jesus. As far as Edouard, though, he's actually played a lot of games. Yes, of course, he's had 1 early sub so far, but for the most part has been an 85 to 90 minute player, which is a huge change from last season. And the increase in underlying stats just makes him a fantastic pick. And you're starting to look at, for example, a perfect fixture like Game Week 6, Fulham at home. At 6.0 to 6.9, Alvarez remains at the top. I've dropped Wisa, even though we're starting to see good fixtures once again for Brentford, Everton and Nottingham Forest back to back. You can keep Wisa, and I would definitely hold Wisa over this run, but I definitely would not look towards transferring Wisa in, which is why Wisa drops as well. I think there's much less value into moving into Wisa for now, and that's why I'm kind of calling out that Wisa is a very good hold, but also not a very good transfer in. And that's sort of to make sure that he's equivalent to some other price brackets and some other players like a Ferguson who can easily slot back into the team in this Bournemouth home fixture. As far as Awani, the only reason why I haven't increased him, even though his underlying stats are very, very good as well, is just because of this Man City fixture, right? After this Man City fixture, I think Awani will easily get a price rise. I'm not exactly sure if he's also worth a transfer in your team. Just because I would still, for example, prefer an Alvarez right now over an Awani, and I don't think he has penalties. So as far as I'm aware, Awani is going to be a good pick. He's probably going to be a second tier pick as soon as next week, but I still probably wouldn't move into him. Yes, he hasn't blanked so far, but it's not like he's so explosive a pick that we can't deny him or ignore him whatsoever. So that's why Awani stays. And the same thing with Solanke, where slightly tougher fixtures, but he's so consistent. He plays 90 minutes and he still actually has really good underlying stats. In fact, improved underlying stats this year. As far as the 7.0 to 7.9 price tier, I have finally given Jackson a fall and Højlund a rise. This is the only real significant change in terms of the meta players. I think you can actually move Jackson out this week into, let's say, an Alvarez if you can get a leak that Alvarez starts. However, I also think that Alvarez is playing so well, and Pep has pretty much communicated the same thing where Alvarez is doing so well. I just think you can't ignore and you can't look back at, let's say, a Nathan Ake situation where Pep said he was undroppable and dropped him last season. It's just simply completely different to a player who is actually carrying almost half of the City attack by himself, given the fact that Haaland and Foden are completely blowing away chances and wasting opportunities in the last few fixtures. Ultimately, Foden's getting minutes, Haaland is getting minutes, and Alvarez is doing nothing wrong really in this team so far. Also on a lot of set pieces and just fantastic pick. So that's going to be Jackson. Unfortunately, Jackson is just a case of fixtures getting worse and worse. And finally, for example, even though I've been asking for people to hold Jackson, he finally failed to deliver in that Bournemouth game, right? It was a good fixture on paper and he really delivered nothing. None of the chances were really good. Yes, of course, people have absolutely memed the opportunity that he had, which he blasted to the stands. That wasn't even remotely close to goal, but that wasn't even a serious opportunity, right? So we're starting to see the opportunities and the underlying stats for Jackson drop. And also the fixtures are getting worse. So this is the time where I'd say it does make sense to move away into another pick like a Højlund. Højlund is someone who we saw got 80 minutes versus Bayern Munich in the Champions League, which means he's an even better pick for the time being. So I really like the fact that I think he can get consistent minutes. And as a young player, of course, even though he's coming back from injury, his ability to maybe ease into the starting position, particularly with a lack of competition, I would say, with Martial right now, makes him a very, very good pick and an interesting differential for now. I'd definitely think about Højlund on a wild card if you were a little bit differential minded. However, you do also need to realize that sacrificing a lot of the money in the forward position means it's even harder, for example, to go for, let's say, a Salah plus Haaland draft or something like that. Or let's say if you really want to move back into Son or move back into Saka plus Odegaard, for example, in a few weeks' time in Game Week 8 or Game Week 10, you still need that money in the midfield. So that's a question that you kind of need to ask yourself. How long are you going to have Højlund in your team, and how long do you want him to be a differential in your team for? However, I think he's a great pick. Isak gets a fall, and that's because right now, Newcastle, we're starting to see the rotation with Wilson. I called it as something that could happen. I didn't expect it to happen so soon, but we saw Wilson start last week, and I think we can see a Wilson start again, which is why Wilson in the tier right below also gets a rise. And for that reason, I think they're both interesting picks because you know that this Newcastle team over a good run of fixtures is going to be very lethal. But the concern, of course, is just going to be minutes. And I think maybe you can even argue that Isak will continue to deserve drops in the future. So that's unfortunately the position that Isak finds himself in. And then, of course, in terms of moving towards defense this week, not too many changes. A lot of the changes are based on new situations and new circumstances. Bell and Kabori both get rises. It really just comes down to the situation of the double gaming fixture. As I said, two sort of runs at the home run lottery. As far as Reguilon, a benefit, of course, simply from the injuries right now. With Wan-Bissaka being out too, you're kind of nailing both Reguilon and Dalot into a lot of fixtures for the short term, where United have really good games and almost guarantees of starts for much cheaper assets that are both attacking, right? Dalot a little bit less direct, but someone who also very, very good at crossing. As far as Reguilon, you're looking at someone who is actually quite direct, quite advanced, but also can't invert into the midfield like Dalot can in the left back position. So both interesting picks, and that's why you can see even Dalot in the next price tier is actually allocated as well as a second tier pick. Gusto, I don't really want to give him a rise because, look, Chelsea's fixtures are actually running out soon, and James should hopefully be back in the short term. And I don't see the point in, for example, moving towards Gusto at any time soon. At the 4.5 position to 4.9, it's all about the Newcastle players. Botman, without an injury concern, starting games now, looking fantastic in the Champions League, even though they were struggling versus AC Milan. Just means, of course, Botman is for me the priority target as far as transfers that are in this price tier. As far as Kasic, Zinchenko, just attacking players. Pinnock sort of replacing Henry in the team just because of Henry's ACL injury. Pinnock, in my opinion, still has less attacking potential, right? He's not a fullback. He's just a center back. But, of course, cheaper than Ben Mee, so I still like him as a pick. And then Dalot, I've already talked about him versus Reguilon. I do think he can actually invert and sometimes play on the left. And if there's any situation where, let's say, Man United feel like they need to play another different right back, then I think Dalot can maybe get more expense than Reguilon, but I do think you can maybe get away with, let's say, just going for Reguilon for the short term. As far as, let's say, Udogie, he only gets a fall just because the two next fixtures are really, really bad on paper. After that, he'll resume being a fantastic pick. And I think he's a very easy hold in your team as someone in the back of your bench that can just sit there for a bit until Game Week 8 comes around, and then you can actually just enjoy the fixtures once again. With Colwill, he's a situation where he's going to get worse and worse each week, and there's not really an appeal to, let's say, going into Colwill for the time being. And unfortunately, as I said, with the 5.0 to 5.5 price bracket, no real interest there. And even with Diaz and Chilwell, even less interest there. The reality is City's fixtures are getting worse and worse. Diaz is quite expensive. You want to sort of move out of Diaz, maybe invest into, let's say, a Salah plus Haaland structure. And the same thing with Chilwell too, where you can easily go into someone like Botman this week instead. At the 6.5 price bracket, I have actually added Robertson as a differential. I don't really like Robertson too much because I think Trippier is just standing there, staring us in the face as a fantastic pick. But Trippier has a cost too, right? Because it's very hard to fit, as I said, the Salah plus Haaland draft, where you also are going for, let's say, some stronger attackers as well in your team and making sure that you actually still have the space for, let's say, a Son or a Rashford, for example. So there is a cost to be made if you go for Trippier or even Robertson, and I don't think Robertson is definitely worth that cost, whereas Trippier, in my opinion, actually is, because he's a huge differential, and I would definitely like to own Trippier in my team. As far as the goalkeepers, there aren't really too many changes. I've actually only added Raya as a second tier option. I do think he's a huge upgrade over Ramsdale as a keeper. Advanced stats will actually tell us this much. Raya is a much better shot stopper. And from the simple eye test, I think he's a much better passer of the ball, much more composed at times, and less capable of making a mistake. I've seen him play a lot for Brentford and ultimately very confident in him as a goalkeeper, as a Spaniard as well. Would love to see him as the sort of Spanish starting national keeper, but that's not happening right now, but he is actually the starting keeper for Arsenal for the time being. We know that Arteta has talked a lot about rotation, which is the only thing that actually keeps me away from making him a green pick. And that's going to be the cheat sheet for this week. So I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and I'll see you guys very shortly.